Good morning, dear classmates. Good morning, dear professor. I hope you are all doing well. I hope you are all safe and healthy. As you all know, today's presentation is going to be about media law reform in Jordan. It is a presentation which is going to be delivered by Gnawi Ayub, Zarqan Mohamed, and Bekkouri Mohamed. Given the current circumstances of the novel coronavirus, however, we found no other solution but to put our presentation in the form of a PowerPoint attached with some short videos in which we explain, of course, those slides shortly. Just to make things indeed clear for you to understand and to remember. Of course, our presentation is divided into three different parts, and each one of us will tackle a particular part separately. But no worries, because all the parts, of course, will be are going to be, of course, put in one final version or in one final PowerPoint. In my part, I will indeed talk about an overview of media reform in Jordan, in which I will tackle three different sections, including milestones in the democratization process, in which I will talk about the historical developments of the democratization process of Jordan, the political diversity and achieving democracy in Jordan, as well as in the second section I will talk about milestones in media law reform, in which I will tackle the historical developments of media law reform in Jordan, freedom of expression, and diversity and transparency of ownership. In the last section of my part, I will talk about media as a platform for democratic discourse. Democratic reform has always been on the agenda in Jordan for decades. Likewise, media reform has also been an important part of the debate in the past few decades. So, as it should be obvious, we are going to start our presentation by talking about the democratization process in Jordan, in which I will, of course, primarily talk about the historical development of the Jordanian, of course, politics, or the political development of Jordan throughout history. Because, as you all know, it is this historical development, of course, which reflects reforms at different levels, at the social level, at the economic level, and of course reforms at the level of media. We are going to start, as I have just said, by talking about milestones in the democratization process. And here I will start first by talking about the historical development or the historical background of this democratization process. In March 1946, the United Kingdom and Jordan concluded a new treaty which recognized the independence of Jordan. Since its independence in 1946, Jordan has undergone several political reforms. Those reforms, however, were very limited, particularly with the catastrophic events that have witnessed Jordan until the 1989 April uprising. And this is according to a report by UNESCO 2005. So indeed, since their independence, and here I am not only talking about Jordan, but since their independence, internal pressures have been, of course, raised in need for political reforms in many Arab countries, not only Jordan, as I have just said. As a result of those pressures, indeed, many reforms have been introduced. Many reforms have been, of course, achieved in many Arab countries again, like, for instance, Bahrain, Qatar, Morocco, and Jordan. But we will indeed talk about Jordan today because it is our main concern. So, in order to understand much about the democratization process of Jordan, it was very much important for me to look for a report called Building Democracy in Jordan. This report has focused on three important aspects, including the electoral processes, political participation of women, and the development of political parties. Of course, I know it is not our concern to talk about the political development, but in order to understand, of course, media reform throughout history in Jordan, it was very much important, of course, or it is very much important for us to understand much about the historical development of politics, or the political developments throughout history in Jordan. So I will tackle briefly those three aspects, inshallah. Since its independence, Jordan, of course, since its independence in 1946, again, Jordan has undergone several political reforms. Those reforms, however, were very limited. Concerning, of course, the electoral system, as I have read indeed in an article, Jordan has also undergone several reforms in terms of this. So Jordanians indeed have experienced elections since the 1990s, but to be indeed more specific, the four elections starting from 1989 to 2003 were the of course the ones which have changed to a large extent the political picture of Jordan. And here we talk about the elections of 1989, 1993, and if I am right, I guess 1997, as well as 19, of course, or 2003, which, as I have just said, have completely changed the political picture of Jordan. Those indeed elections have really left their mark on the contemporary, of course, Jordanian society. And concerning, of course, the political participation of women, Jordan has also had important achievements regarding, of course, women's rights, and of course raising their stages in society, in addition to being, of course, engaged in their work, education and politics. Women have obtained so many, or a number of rights. But of course, it is not our concern today. As I told you, I am just trying to give you some hints about the political developments throughout history in Jordan. But concerning the political, of course, parties, as you all know, or political parties, as you all know, of course, are the pillars of any country's politics. They are indeed considered to be the most fundamental, of course, mechanisms for the political participation in Jordan. They can be indeed traced back to the founding of the state, but at the very beginning they reflected early social structures. Then, of course, they became a very strong voice calling for the country's independence during the colonial era. But nevertheless, those political parties are generally absent in Jordan due to the obstacles, of course, of licensing, as well as the limited or the very limited access to parliamentary seats. So indeed, those political developments, or those political reforms, have largely changed the political picture of the state. But indeed, as I told you before, those political reforms go hand in hand with, of course, the development of media in Jordan. So those reforms have also completely changed the shape of media in Jordan, because reforms should be mirrored indeed by, or should be measured or mirrored by, indeed, independent and free media. Just to put it in simple terms, they tried to build, of course, strong relationships with media in order to wield, of course, influence in different areas, as well as, of course, to sustain a certain ideological guideline. That's why I told you at the very beginning that, of course, we cannot talk about the historical developments of media without talking about the historical development of the politics of Jordan. Political diversity and achieving democracy in Jordan. Since the 1989 April uprising, Jordan has made a remarkable progress toward establishing the basics of a pluralistic, organized political structure. Since 1989, again, important democratic, of course, gains have been achieved, particularly regular democratic elections. But from 2011, the starting point of the Arab Spring, Jordan has witnessed greater democratic accountability, transparency, political pluralism, and stronger, let's say, civil society. So we will indeed talk about these historical developments, of course, of the or these political developments of Jordan from 1989 or the 1989 April uprising until now in relation to media, just to in order not to make you confused. So milestones in media law reform, historical background. Since its independence in 19, of course, 46, Jordan has imposed a great censorship of the media, particularly the press. This censorship has been even more reinforced in the 1980s, with Leila Sharaf becoming the Minister of Information. Nevertheless, Jordan's media has witnessed a great transformation since 1989. This transformation can be divided into two different phases. Here we talk about from 1989 to 2011. Since 1989, there have been important steps in terms of media freedom in Jordan, a freedom which has led to a lively and reasonably diverse media in the country. Yet, with the important shift toward democracy that has witnessed Jordan in the 1980s, media, particularly the press, didn't play an essential role in preparing for this shift due to the censorship or the great censorship that has been imposed by the state. And this is again according to the report of building democracy in Jordan or democracy in Jordan by UNESCO in 2005. So the 1989 April uprising was indeed an important point in Jordan's democratic trajectory. There have been indeed so many uprisings in response to the increases in the prices of oil, transportation, and food. This, of course, has led to important and significant changes in terms of freedom of expression and hence freedom of the press. In the aftermath of the April uprising, indeed, or the as an outcome of the April uprising of 1989, many progressive laws were put or have been put. For instance, a multi-party system was established with greater freedom to print newspapers. And notice, please, here that we are talking about the political development of Jordan in relation to media, in order not to confuse you. And of course, with Abdullah II becoming, of course, the king of Jordan, I think, if I am right, in 1999, many political reforms took place. Hence, Jordan, of course, started promoting the idea of a modern democratic state. Transparency, justice, equal rights, freedom, and then freedom of media started to appear. So, and in terms of media here, and in relation to those political, of course, reforms, King Abdullah II, of course, delivered a royal message to the government in 2011 to develop, of course, media strategy, a media strategy, of course, which is based on the principles of freedom and responsibility. He, of course, affirmed, or he has made it clear, that the national media in all its, of course, forms, in all its kinds, whether it is print, visual, audio, or even electronic, should reflect, of course, the highest standards of professionalism and responsibility. So now we are starting to talk about indeed the second phase of development, which took place after 2011, which was, of course, marked by the first waves or the first waves of the Arab Spring. So the actual media reform took place in 2011, coinciding with the first waves of the Arab Spring. In what they call the national media strategy, Jordan's media has been largely developed between 2011 and 2015. This strategy has created an environment which supports the development of an independent and free media. So generally, when we talk about media situation in Jordan, print media are currently still or are still, of course, struggling to survive, especially, of course, with the limited or with the very limited freedom of traditional media. Those news websites, and this happens even in Morocco, those news websites indeed have become a vital as well as an important and significant source of information. Given this regard, of course, the United Union, of course, has supported media in Jordan, aiming to increase, of course, freedom, independence, and let's say professionalism of the Jordanian media. And here, please, we are talking about the National Media Strategy 2011 and 2015, which I have just mentioned, of course, here within the slide, which aims primarily to create an environment which supports, of course, the development of an independent and free media. An independent media, of course, which ensures, that is to say, which ensures indeed a balance between freedom and responsibility. This strategy indeed notes that the Jordan media or the Jordan media is not only an essential component of the reform process, but also an important and significant component for promoting this reform. That is to say, in order for the state to of course achieve a great political reform, it is in need of this media, and hence they need, of course, to develop of course, a media system based on independence and freedom of expression. So, talking about freedom of expression in terms of media, the Constitution, of course, includes strong guarantees for media freedom. This, however, of course, does not fully measure up to the international guarantees, as they protect only the right of media to impart, not to seek and receive information. Although Jordan was, of course, a regional leader in terms of being the first country in MENA, and when I say MENA, it means Middle East and North Africa, to adopt the right to information law, its media system faces a serious problem in terms of lack of independence. So, the National Charter of Jordan, or in the National Charter of Jordan, it is clearly stated that mass media indeed play an important and essential role in strengthening, of course, democratic processes. Hence, media or freedom of expression and freedom of thought, as well as freedom of information, should be viewed as a right for, of course, the press and other, of course, media types. However, despite all this, the Jordanian media, as I have just mentioned within the slides, is still, of course, facing or are still facing a great censorship on the part of the state, and hence they are still very far away indeed from being free and independent. So now we move on to talk about media in Jordan, diversity and transparency of ownership. So in 2002, the public monopoly on broadcasting has been brought to an end, putting the ground to the establishment of a number of both radio and television stations. This has increased the diversity of media outputs for Jordanians, and this is still according to a report, of course, of UNESCO 2005. Nevertheless, this reform, of course, has been limited, as it recognized, of course, only two types of broadcasters, including public and private broadcasters, with no legal rules, of course, governing community broadcasters. Of course, despite those reforms, despite those developments, despite those, let's say, historical reforms and developments that have, of course, witnessed the Jordanian media throughout history, and particularly starting from the 1989 April uprising until, of course, now, there are still, of course, facing a series, of course, challenges in terms of the great censorship imposed by the state. And of course, many people are still, of course, considering that media in Jordan is nothing but a platform for democratic discourse. But the question that we are going to ask here is, to what extent can we consider that media in Jordan is a platform for democratic discourse? To end up, of course, our presentation, we have to answer this question: is, of course, media in Jordan considered as a platform for democratic discourse? So media outlets concentrate on the capital Amman, with less attention being paid to issues of concern to those living in other cities and agglomerations. Also, women and other groups, such as refugees, for instance, are poorly represented in Jordan's media. Jordan's media system is still far away from being independent from the government, both in structural terms as well as in practice. Indeed, of course, the Article 6 of the Press and Publications Law states or makes it clear that or states that freedom, of course, of the press should include informing citizens of the events, informing citizens of IDs, informing citizens of information in all different fields. It should also include, of course, enabling citizens, political parties, unions, cultural, social, economic institutions to express, of course, their thoughts and opinions. And this, of course, also includes media, which, of course, should express, should have the right, of course, to express their thoughts and opinions. Yet, or nonetheless, media in Jordan does not really meet those obligations, just like Morocco. Because in media, we don't have what we call an independent and free media, but all media in Jordan are, of course, controlled by the government. So most media outlets are based in Amman, are concentrated in Amman, the capital of Jordan, which makes them, of course, difficult, which makes it, of course, or makes them difficult to access for those people living in other governorates, living in those small cities, those small agglomerations, those small, of course, towns, and so on and so forth. Implying what? Implying that there are no local television stations or daily newspapers outside the capital, Amman. So also they tend, of course, or they do nothing. I'm talking here about media. They do nothing, of course, but articulating the voice of the government because of the great, again, censorship imposed on them. And here, if you compare, of course, the Jordan's media with the Moroccan's media, you find that there are a lot of similarities in terms of this great censorship imposed on them. So also, or in addition to this, because as I told you one day in class, because of the, if you remember, because of the financial support of the media, or because the financial support of the media is paid by the government. So the content producers are facing unpredictable censorship. Hence, in order to survive, they intentionally, of course, comply with the ideological guidelines of the states rather than, of course, challenging or opposing them because of the great, again, censorship imposed on them, as well as, of course, lack of financial support, meaning that they have to comply with those ideological guidelines to financially, of course, survive. So they directly, again, and intentionally participate in the maintenance of the ideological hegemony of the states. For this reason, of course, we cannot say that media in Jordan is really, we cannot but to say that media in Jordan is really a platform for an ideological discourse. And we cannot also talk about what we call a free or an independent media. With the exception, indeed, just to conclude, we can say that with the exception, indeed, with only a few opposition papers, and here we are talking about the meaning those independent, or let's say not independent but party affiliated, those affiliated with certain, of course, political parties. The government, of course, media dominates, of course, the Jordanian media scene to a large extent. Television, radio, and as well as news agencies are all under direct government supervision, are all under direct government censorship. Daily newspapers, of course, tend to adhere, of course, the broad headlines of the the government's policy and respects, of course, this framework. But of course, they have freedom. We cannot say that there is no freedom in terms of media in Jordan, but they have freedom to express their opinions as long as they stay away from those forbidden issues, or what we call red lines. And this, of course, this is exactly what happens in Morocco. That's why I told you a few minutes ago that when we compare, of course, the Moroccan media with the Jordanian media, we find that there are a lot of similarities. So to this point, I can tell you that I have just finished my part. I try to make it, of course, as short as possible in order for you, of course, to follow the presentation effectively. So thank you very much for your attention, and please, if you have any question, anything which you didn't understand, anything which you didn't grasp, you are very much welcome to ask me any question. You are very much welcome again, and don't hesitate. You can contact me on private to answer any question. And as I have just said, until this point, or to this point, I have finished my part. And please contact me. Don't hesitate to contact me if you have any question. And so I let you now with the second part, of course, of our oral presentation with my friend Zarqan Mohamed. And of course, the third and the last part will be delivered by Gnawi Ayub. And thank you very much for your attention and your time. And stay safe and healthy. Thank you.